This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country and join their calls for justice.
All right, Flaggate. Let's jump straight into it. Come on. This is the big issue of the week. We've got to get your Flaggate takes. Alison Pennington, what did you think of the fact that at a press conference, Adam Bandt moved the Australian flag out of the shot? Journalist Isabel Rowe tweeted about it. All hell broke loose. He was described as a traitor. He was committing treason. He was called a snivelling little weasel, I think, by some LNP backbencher.
Adam Bandt is a national disgrace. All I'm seeing from this little weasel is this same virtue signalling.
Oh, it's stupid. It was irrational. It was immature.
Disrespects Australia. He's got it all the wrong way round.
His ego's out of control.
Pathetic.
Immature. Crazy.
And Australians deserve so much better than that.
What do you think? Do you give a shit at all about where the Australian flag is placed in Greens press conferences?
I give a shit about the performance of the Greens and their capacity to succeed. And I think, look, it's the perennial problem anytime you want to make progress. You've got to deal with the Murdoch press, and strategy has to be aligned, knowing that things will be confected, things will be structured to tell a story. I noticed in the way that over time, as Bandt was responding to the critiques, the platform or the idea of a republic came up. And I think they're like, if that's the policy of the Greens to move towards some sort of referendum on becoming a republic, that should have been in part of the election platform. But I think that I don't think that it was necessarily thought through.
All right.
Let's have the back and forth, because I think it'd be...
That's all we have time for, Alison. No, look, I think a bunch of this is stupid too, okay? Here's some stupid things that are in favour of the Greens. Adam Bandt has been doing this since 2020, okay? So this has been a long-standing policy throughout all his press conferences that the Australian flag has not appeared behind him as Greens leader, okay? So the idea that this was a stunt is just simply not correct, because it's been happening for 2 years. No one gave a shit whatsoever. It came through in one particular tweet, and then, bingo bango, the insane right-wing media have their fun with it. So I think that's right. A republic is part of the Greens Party platform. It wasn't centred or fronted as a particular policy during the election campaign, but the Greens have a long-standing policy to abolish the monarchy, and I don't think that would surprise anyone. The justification from Adam's point of view and from Lydia Thorpe's point of view on the project as well is about what that flag represents in terms of the Union Jack and the legacy of colonisation. This is all certainly true, and again, something the Greens talk about on a very regular basis. Now, I think when you say things like, this flag represents pain and is awful for all First Nations people, I think you're absolutely going to get into trouble, because there are plenty of Aboriginal people who either don't give a fuck about the flag, don't feel that way about the flag, might feel particularly fondly toward the flag. So I think, and this happens a lot particularly when whiteys talk about the positions or thoughts and feelings of First Nations or Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people in this country, making a broad generic statement about how all people who are in that particular identity group feel about the Australian flag is just simply not true. And you've seen conservative Aboriginal people come forward and say, this is ridiculous and we don't agree with that. I think that's fine. Also, I think the correct position is to not give a fuck either way, which really does cut both ways. Both moving the flag is not some extraordinarily revolutionary act that's going to materially change people's lives. At the same time, the people who have labelled Lydia Thorpe an enemy of the state, who have raised questions as to whether this casts dispersions over the legitimacy of Adam Bandt being a member of Parliament or Lydia Thorpe being a member of Parliament, or that it is indicative of a hatred of this country and everyone who lives within it, are equally ridiculous. Perhaps we're all idiots, just circling towards freedom.
Look, Tom, everything about what you said is correct, right? We have to respond and defend against any type of attack on this type of terrain, right? But I'm thinking of what is it at a time when the Greens have opened up all this space to be able to represent on a broader economic frame, a broader class frame now. Would it be representative of all the people they're trying to reach right now that they're at that point where they would believe and, want that demonstration of a solidarity and a conviction for, Aboriginal justice? Is all the Australian population at that point yet? Well, are all the people that the Greens trying to reach at that point? How are they bringing people along? And that's, for me, I grew up in a working class, western suburbs of Adelaide. They're fucking Australian, excuse my language. There's Australian flags that fly around the place. People fly Australian flags, and it's not because they're my enemy. Like, it's because they have a genuine association and a pride or a true belief that like what they've fought for in their working lives is attributed to being part of Australia. And those questions, these are complex. We can't pretend that like large volumes of the Australian population are at a point where they're ready for that, and I think that's a really big political discussion. And I think, are the Greens about performing the end point, or are they about the means? Are they about bringing people along and building that politic together?
But why is flying the Australian flag, which people have an absolute right to do, seen as like the default, or that's seen as just as normal, or that's seen as a choice that people make because they believe in what that flag represents? So the flag has symbolic merit of some kind. So people flying it, that's okay, that's fine. Someone who chooses not to display that flag at their own press conference is seen as an attack on people who do like to fly the flag. Why is that the case?
Oh, no, of course. But like you're going back to the reaction. It's about the fodder that's being provided and given, handballed to the right to be able to go for the bash. And it's the easiest fodder. It's the easiest material. Like, it's really just been handed to them on a platter. I think we have to make it a lot harder for them. And doesn't mean we always shape what we do in relation to them, actually. We should be confidently putting forward a strong progressive politic that brings people along. And I think it gets back to the question, if you looked at data and looked at where the Australian population are at, I don't think that necessarily even a republic is actually front of mind. I think people like public holidays, like material aspects of where they're at, right? And if you said to people, like, we'll become a republic, but you lose the Queen's birthday weekend, they might be like, maybe not. That's not to say I'm a Republican. I'm really into it, but I just don't think that public debate is there yet. I think Australians are really suffering from like serious material constraints. They're looking for a cohesive, big, positive picture of a better future. And I don't think that's necessarily the politic that's doing it right now.
I mean, look, you and I, again, and lots of people could agree endlessly about how fucked our media culture is. I mean, again, this press conference was about the climate crisis, which everyone could agree is way more important than the fucking flags. And at this point is more important than establishing a monarchy, right? In terms of the immediacy of those problems, that's fine. But I suppose we know how fucked the media is and what they will run with. And the oxygen that has been taken up by this issue, but then also, getting in front of public opinion. I mean, that's something that I'm very proud of and identify with the Greens with over a very long period of time. We were talking about gay marriage when nobody else was. We were talking about a corruption commission when nobody else was. Like, the idea of waiting for public opinion, the idea that you can't influence public opinion in some way. I mean, in all the interviews that I read with Adam Bant discussing this issue, his response seemed very well balanced and thought out to me. Now, of course it does, because I'm me, but at least, the conversation that was had in the media about why they did that. They didn't back down. They didn't apologize for doing this. They had a principle. That principle goes against the status quo and what a conservative mindset of Australia looks like, and they stuck by it. I think there's some value to that, no?
Yeah, and sure, if they choose this as part of their main platform coming out of the election and start building the genuine politic behind it, great. Like, if that's their conviction and if that's been decided upon by the Greens members, if that's the direction they want to go in, then sure. I think it would be strategically a misstep to be raising a discussion about the Republic as a way to kind of resolve all of these massive redistribution problems we have, the collapse of the union movement, below poverty income support rates. Like, if you think that a politic of a republic is going to help to cohere people and pull us out of that, the national question has helped people to cohere each other throughout history, right? But is now the right time for the national question, the future of the identity of the nation? I don't think that. I think that I'm an old school materialist in the sense that I think that identities and cultures are created by people in motion when they are addressing the fundamental, constraints on their ability to reproduce their lives. And in the process of moving and fighting, they create a vision for themselves. And of course, we need leadership on cultural issues as well, but they can't be separated. They have to be done in tandem. Would
you make the same critique of Labor, including the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flag in all their press conferences?
Well, they're in government, so no, but like they went in, they had a small target strategy, but they had a pretty clear program that was going to address cost of living. They said we're going to do this. They said we're going to deal with the wages problem and the insecure work issues. Like, not a lot on paper committed, but, you know, at least there was, by all accounts, looking at the result of the election, like that spoke to people a lot. And so our research at the Centre for Future Work showed that something like almost 90% of Australians think that wages should be keeping up with inflation. And that was one of the main wars and the terrain that Albanese really nailed, I think, leading into election. So in that sense, I think they've established their credentials to the Australian population about what they're going to do on the fact that life is getting harder, paying bills is getting harder. Whether they
but hang on, but I'm talking about the flags. Okay, so the Labor Party introduced a policy of putting those. So you're saying with those material promises and winning government, with those material signals, buys them the license to then do something that is fundamentally symbolic, which includes including those. Okay, all right.
Absolutely.
And the Greens aren't allowed to do. I mean, it's the Greens' own press conference. Why can't the Greens determine what their press conference looks like?
Of course they can. I mean, this is if we're talking about the terrain of politics and what's going to happen if you decide that as your strategic move, all right, from now on, we never have the Australian flag in our press conferences. You're just, like I said, you're just giving fodder to the right to smash you time and again and malign you with a large volume of working class people who still relate to the Australian flag. I think it's not smart.
Yeah. Fair enough. Well, another person with a take is my regular co-host, Emerald Moon, who is still on holidays, and I'll introduce Alison properly in a second, and it's very cool that she's here co-hosting with us because she's very smart, as you've just heard. But Emerald Moon beamed in from South Korea with her flag take, and it sounds like this.
So Tom wants me to record my flag take, which, look, it's not a thing. I mean, obviously, we know that, but, like, in case people don't realise, Adam didn't call a press conference and be like, I'm going to move this flag and this is a thing. He simply would have always moved the flag out of the way when he's doing a press conference because press conferences are staged. Like, you put behind you what you want to be behind you. There aren't normally a perfect selection of people in high vis for a Labor press conference that are just doing their thing. They're put there. People don't stand in a perfect triangle formation behind you. They're put there. And to report it as a stunt or a thing that Adam actually did is, I mean, it's a lie, and it's obviously bad journalism. And that's aside from the fact that the flag with the Union Jack in particular, represents, ongoing dispossession, colonisation of a country over which Indigenous sovereignty was never ceded. But all of that aside, I've been thinking, because I've been quite homesick actually at this point. I've been away too long. I've also been physically sick. I've had a cold, feeling sorry for myself. And I was thinking about things that would represent Australia better to me that I would like Adam to stand in front of when he does his press conferences rather than the flag. Like a pile of fresh fruit and vegetables, where you can just buy one apple from the supermarket, or fresh milk, or beautiful public beaches and streets that you walk down where there's a bin, nearby that you can put your rubbish into, or a nice cup of tea. Or he could just stand in front of, my friends and family. And yeah, that would be better than the stupid flag anyway. So, bye. I miss you all. Love you.
I think it's disgusting and almost treasonous.
Antics like this virtue signaling, saying I love First Nations people more than anyone else, it turns more people off than turns them on.
I like to hug the flag. I just like to hug it. I love this country.
Frankly, I've always found the Greens to be a real serious danger to Australia.
Serious danger to Australia.
Yes, it is Serious Danger, a podcast about green politics in Australia. It is not an official Greens Party podcast. We are independent, goddammit, made possible with the help of the Green Institute and our producer, Michael the Griffin. I am Tom Ballard. This week's special guest, co-host, filling in for Emerald, is a senior economist at the Australia Institute's Centre for Future Work. She's on Twitter at AK_Pennington. Comrade Alison Pennington, welcome to the show. Hello.
Hola. Hello. Thanks for having me. Oh, you should. I hope you're feeling all right there, Tom.
Oh yeah, I have COVID. That's why I both sound and look like shit. You recently, you're a survivor as well. You've recently come through it.
It's a bastard. I think that, we're in this mass delusion period of living in a pandemic and people want to pretend it's not here. But this bastard virus, it's going to keep it's going to keep changing itself. entering our bodies in new ways. And I did not enjoy that experience. I've only just come out the other side. It probably took me like almost a month to
It's just like,
recover.
it is a deep fatigue. I'm sorry, I'm only getting, sympathetic about this now, 2.5 years into the pandemic now that it's affecting me. But it's deep fatigue. It's the feeling like not being able to do anything, and it's the biggest head cold. I also think it's like I haven't really been any kind of sick for 2.5 years, right? Because I've just been inside and been very hygienic for so long. So I've had no experience of sickness whatsoever, and now here we are. I think it's from my brother's wedding, which happened over the weekend, and he had like one of those phones where people can leave a message for the happy couple. And I think lots of people were getting on that phone over the night and just yelling and licking that phone. And that's why I'm sick now.
Oh,
it is not
that's not a COVID-safe protocol. Right there.
Thank you for being here. We've been mates for a while. You've been on my other podcast. I think you're a fantastic thinker, great comrade. You came from the socialist world. You're now fully in the economic industrial complex. I always enjoy your tweets and your insights into the political economy. What do you make of the Greens, warts and all, as a political party, as a political project? You said before that you're invested in the Greens doing well. What do you make of the Australian Greens?
Well, massive question. I've been engaged in activists and activism and various organisations since I was young, and I've always had a relationship to the Greens, working alongside them. So I guess the question is for me, if I'm honest about why at this point in time I'm not active in the Greens, besides the fact that I work in an independent think tank. But for me, I look at like the birth of the Greens strongly intertwined with movements and, a narrow frame because it came out of the environment movement, but there was a recognition that the political form reflected the movement of people to achieve aims together. So it was like had a democratic face. Over time, as the Greens have expanded, try to find their way, they've massively expanded their platform, what they stand for. They've reached way more people. But I think that the party's confused about whether it's a predominantly an electoral outfit, whether it's a focused on representation in Parliament and leveraging off of those parliamentarians, by keeping some branch structures going, or they have a more active orientation to movement building and democratic practice and building parties that reaches people, engages them. So for me, I look at the state of things, the way I approach my work, and it's why I'm part of the the economic industrial complex. I'm at this point in the way I do my work because I think fundamentally things are screwed up for people. They're poor, they're pissed off, they're disconnected, highly disconnected from mainstream politics. They're alienated from each other. Their communities have been smashed. I think they're materially and spiritually suffering. But they want to fight and they want to do stuff. That's from the way I grew up and what I've seen in my life. So I think that part of fixing that means that those people have to be active participants in changing their lives. And in that sense, I have a view of the role of a party in this situation, which is that the party is supposed to reach people, mobilise them, engage them, and be able to go up to someone on the street and say, if you get involved, your life can change. And I think that proposition is clear for the union movement. I think unions can say, in the least, we've got work to do, join us and come fight us to do that. And I think the Greens haven't worked out how to, get back to that movement base, to how it is that the political party started. I look at the way some of that confusion manifests, and it is kind of aggravating because there's so much space, there's a vacuum to be filled, especially now that we have Labor in government. And, it manifests with things like, performing politics rather than actually trying to reach people. It's like, I remember early, before in the election campaign, there was a tweet that went out. Adam put out a tweet that said, Year 12 results are coming along, whether you want to be, a doctor or a police officer or listed occupations, or whether you're just tired or you just want to smoke weed for a couple of years before you work it out, doesn't matter. And everyone's like, ha ha ha, that's funny. That's, it's signaling to a anti-establishment culture, a youth culture. But the fact is, actually what young people who feel like smoking weed for a couple of years would benefit from is leadership on all the reasons why there's no fucking jobs for them to get. Their degrees are costing more. They have no hope in the future, right? I think it's just an insight into why it is that fissuring of the the role of electoral politics and movement building has been broken up. So I have a strong vested interest in, seeing the success of the Greens, and I've got some great comrades and friends that do amazing work. And I think the election is like the best opening that you've had for a long time to broaden that economic base and show leadership on a strong progressive platform that reaches people and tells them why the economy keeps shitting on them and how they can work together to improve their lives.
Okay, but we've done a fair bit of that. I think reducing the political offer of the Greens to one tweet from Adam about smoking weed every day isn't necessarily true, right?
It's just, come on. It's a podcast. I can't give you like my full thesis, right? It's just like one example.
Okay, yeah, sure. What about at the press conferences? He has the Australian flag, but he's smoking a blunt while he delivers the press conference. Is that acceptable? Thank you very much, Tick for laying that out. I'm sure that will come through to our discussion. But thank you very much for being here and for saying that. Appreciate it. Very quickly, bit of housekeeping. Want to say a huge thank you. There has been a wave of new Serious Danger patrons got on board. You can go to patreon.com/SeriousDangerAU. Even for as little as like $3 a month. I think it's like 75 cents a weekly episode, plus the bonus content you get. It's a very good deal. Dan Tobias, Dan, Oxy, Jack, Ryrie, G, Sean Brosnan, Lettucehead, Izell, Paul, Kath, Charlotte, Ben, Jai, Grace, Mitchell, Left Field, Ingrid, L, Ben, Cameron. All right, there's too many here. Someone called Can I Get 4 Deconstructed Cronenbergers, Please, is one of our patrons. We love you all. Thank you very much. If you can spare it, go to the patreon.com/SeriousDangerAU. There is a patrons only app out now, a new one that you can access. That's with me and Emerald talking about a spicy ideology and the 4 pillars and the ideological makeup of the Greens that you might enjoy. Again, that money helps us pay our wonderful producer and helps us keep the lights on. Emerald and I are volunteering. Alison Pennington is volunteering. I hope she knows that I'm exploiting her labor for the sake of this podcast. Also want to say a huge thank you to listener Riley and patron Riley who got in touch. He put up posters of this show. We sent him a poster design. He just put up posters all over the Central Coast celebrating Serious Danger. It was delightful and very nice. And if you want to do the same thing, you can always email us, hello@seriousdanger.pod.com. Some people reached out like, hey, send us the design. We'll do that where we live too. That would be really lovely. And finally, before we get into nitty-gritty of stuff, I reckon we need a new theme song. The theme music that we use for this podcast is pretty generic. It's like rights-free music that we're able to secure. I don't know. If there are any musically inclined people who listen to this show who would be prepared to put together some kind of cool thing that's an original piece for Serious Danger, that would be really great. Please get in touch. hello@seriousdangerpod.com.
In this economy.
Money in this kind of an economy.
How are you guys holding up in this economy?
We're all tightening our belts in this economy.
Right.
Especially in this economy.
In this economy.
Especially in this economy.
A job in this economy. But here's one for you. Our personal finance editor, Jerry Willis, to say, don't settle. How you could actually get a raise in this economy.
All right, let's talk about actual stuff. We're going through some pretty wacky economic times right now, Alison. A lot of talk about inflation. There is a cost of living crisis that we've talked about on the show a fair bit. Wages, interest rates. There may be even a fucking recession on the way. Some talk of that. You're an economist, Alison Pennington. Give us the broad picture if you can. How would you describe the current economic conditions that Australia is facing right now?
Well, I mean, for massive people, this is the cost of living crisis. And that's like a way that it brands it the moment in the media. But what it is actually an insight into compounding economic problems that we know we've been facing for a long time. There will be, I think, there's a strong interest in painting, like always, politically in this time, this moment as something that's crisis bound, like it's a response to the pandemic. The pandemic is definitely part of the story. It's created some of the crisis, but I really want to emphasize that these are compounding problems, and that compounding issues around the way we organize our economy. So, the macro, high level shit, we've got inflation running at 5.1% in the 12 months to March, right? When that number came out, everyone was like, gosh, go right. And then what happens is once we get a high inflation figure, because our entire economic apparatus is focused on how to maintain low inflation, it just rebirths all of the arguments that have happened over decades in political economy about why does inflation go up? And that means prices. Why are things getting more expensive? And intuitively, people would be like, yeah, there's a lot of big dogs who have a lot of power, who have the power to charge me more for shit when they shouldn't be. And I think the intuition of working people is very different to what's happening on the commentary in the media. So what you'll hear at this time is that wages are the problem, right? The problem is that workers earn too much, and that's why prices are going up. People have too much money in their pockets, and they're trying to go out and buy heaps of stuff, and they ain't saying enough stuff to buy, which means the prices are going up. Of course, that's complete bullshit, right? Like, real wages have gone backwards by 2% in the last year. How is it then, since 2013, if unit labour costs, is the way we measure the cost of labour, if it's been growing slower than inflation, let alone productivity, let alone the value that they're creating on the job that's being captured in profits, just the higher prices, unit labour costs are growing slower than inflation, how can it be then that wages and labour costs are being passed on to higher prices? So, yeah, and so then you ask a question, okay, why are things more expensive now? And I think this is really important. Like, we have to prepare for this because this is a years-long debate. Like, inflation is basically class war. You know, it is the battle lines. It's the front, it's the Trojan horse for wider interests. So we did have obviously a higher price of oil and petrol because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Then you have the COVID impacts. The OECD themselves acknowledge that you've got like people wanting to actually buy more IT goods. We had a shift in the way that people buy stuff. Retail changed because there's more online shopping. So there was like some shift in the way that people buy and the stuff they get. But we also had people who were getting sick across the world. Production slowed down. It gets disrupted. You can't manufacture goods if you don't have people there to make the stuff or to ship it. But then also price gouging. Like, even the OECD has acknowledged that we're at a point now where global capital is so centralized and powerful that there's just like mass price gouging going on. And that is reflected domestically in Australia too. So what we have now, that compounding issue, we have compounding power, centralized power of large oligopolies and monopolies that have the power to charge what they want. Think about utilities. Think about Woolies and Coles. Think about the privatization of education. Think about the doubling of humanities degrees, like the cost of a humanities degree. All of those higher childcare costs, they all flow into CPI. They all flow into inflation. So inflation, I guess, is just to bring it home, it's about how we organize the economy, the price setting power that we give to capital. And it's also about privatization, austerity, and that whole agenda that government has created by creating markets out of the essential goods that people need.
So you've got this shit show of these factors applying, and take your point, this has been coming for a long time, but this particular moment of crisis with the Russian-Ukraine situation and the supply chains hitting at the same time and greedy capitalists taking advantage of that. So the economic wisdom or the orthodoxy is when inflation gets really bad, then the central bank, the Reserve Bank, does its job of trying to keep inflation low by increasing interest rates, by increasing the cost of borrowing to take a bit of heat out of the economy to slow things down. But again, I'm basic bitch economics here, but my understanding is that does not help, because if they increase interest rates and it just makes implication of that, it makes it harder for everyone to pay their mortgage, and those costs hit workers. Like, increasing interest rates doesn't stop Russia invading Ukraine or won't immediately solve all the supply chain issues that we have. Am I right? Is it like, how the fuck is that justified that the Reserve Bank just jacks up interest rates to addressing medicine for a problem that they're not actually trying to solve in that respect? That seems crazy.
Well, it should seem crazy because it's exactly right, everything you said. Because I think, again, like, intuitively, a lot of working people can see that this isn't quite right? So, yes, increasing interest rates right now to stop people from spending money isn't going to deal with the drivers of inflation, because the problem isn't that wages are too high and people are buying too much. To give you an insight into just how supremely fucked up this is, most of the inflation right now is in essential goods.
Right.
It's in non-discretionary goods. It's running at like 6.6% in the year to March, compared to like 2.7 or something for discretionary spending. So the non-discretionary spending is groceries, a roof over your head, utilities, education and healthcare. Non-discretionary, going out, having beers, seeing shows, travel,
whoa.
culture.
Seeing shows is essential spending, okay? And I think we can all agree that people supporting the arts and seeing your favourite comedians live on stage is fundamental to a decent life. Okay, let's make that clear.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we should have a program fighting for the reconstitution of CPI and redefining the arts for sure. But then you have to ask, like, are we trying to put less food in fridges? Are we trying to make people miss a utility bill? Like intermittent homelessness? Like, how is it that reducing demand for the substance of life is even conceived of a strategy for dealing with this inflation right now? So I have been trying to push from day dot the very clear issues of how we're organising the economy, the fact that the government has a role to bring down the cost of living, bring down the cost of things by, let's talk about it, putting all of our utilities back into public hands, reducing out-of-pocket costs for Medicare or for the Medicare system, making childcare free, right? There are all these things that government can do, putting universities back into public hands. That will bring down the cost of essential goods, which is driving inflation at the moment. And then, of course, this conversation can't happen without talking about regulating the size and the power of price-setting powers in corporations. You know, we have to talk about competition policy again. We have to stop like massive mergers that lead to these behemoths that can, pillage and take what they like. And so but these questions, as like you can see, Tom, I'm getting to like big, broader structural questions. That these are platform issues that are going to take a long time to build the momentum for. But, in many ways, we don't get to choose these circumstances, like politics happens in the terrain of our own choosing, right? So, but the fact is we have this crisis. We have to be honest with people about how to respond to it. Definitely, making people poorer. And by the way, the biggest winners of this whole interest rate hike are going to be banks, because the majority of their liabilities are in mortgages. In fact, they hardly ever give out bloody business loans anymore. It's very hard to get a business loan. But if you want to take out a mortgage, there'll be a bank there ready to give it to you. And
in a very direct way, this seems to would exacerbate the cost of living crisis, because you increase interest rates, mortgages get more expensive, and fucking property investors will pass those increased costs directly onto their renters, right? And without any kind of rental caps or control over rents, the millions of people renting across this country, as they're facing this cost of living crisis on, as you say, food and a bunch of other essentials, their rents are going to go up. I think they're up 20% or something like insane like that, right? Like it's a direct, terrible impact on some of the most precarious people in all of society.
Yeah, and even though landlords will be in a better position to absorb that extra cost, they'll pass it straight on to renters, because we have an undersupply of rental properties. And what will happen? I suspect the pressure that'll come onto renters, it'll manifest in people demanding stronger income support payments. And I think the way that Labor will get around this is by increasing the rent assistance payment, Commonwealth rent assistance, which is, if you look at it on paper, just like billions of dollars that go out in public coffers all the time to subsidise a private rental market that's broken. At what point do we start looking at that pool of funds and say we could build good public housing for this money, and start removing this feudal type social relation that we're propagating through the housing market. But the interest rate increase will hurt the poorest the most, even though a lot of the public debate right now is like, the mortgages, they're gonna suffer, the homeowners. It's everyday people that will suffer the most. And, also the flow-on effects, Tom, because if the message that the RBA is trying to send, it's lying, because it's not being clear about what it's really trying to do, which is bring inflation down because it's trying to protect financial markets, right? But what that effect is going to do is if you squeeze the capacity of people to go out and spend on non-discretionary stuff. So if more of their budget is like paying the mortgage, paying the bills, and they've got less money to go out, whose jobs depend on that non-discretionary spending, right? Everyone's talking about wages pressure and job shortages in hospitality because, the jobs are crap and they're poorly paid. But if there was any chance of pressure in those industries now, particularly for young workers to be unionising and organising, the RBA has just ripped out all of the potential pressure in those spaces, because unemployment's going to increase. There'll be less jobs in these areas and people aren't going to be going out and spending as much. Like, the RBA is trying to create unemployment to slow down the economy, and that unemployment will fall disproportionately on young people.
But one of their jobs is to ensure full employment.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, look, I want to come to the RBA in a sec, but I think fundamental to this too that would be really great, and I know it might be difficult to give us a short, pithy explainer on the 1970s, but there's been a lot of discussion about comparing our current economic status quo to what happened to the worldwide economy or the Western economy in the 1970s. And the more you read about this stuff, the birth of neoliberalism all dates back to this particular decade and the crazy shit that went down. For our listeners who might be, again, economics basic bitches like myself, can you give us an overview of what happened in the 1970s that people keep talking about and why that's so different to the status quo that we face today?
For the record, like we've all been taught to be, basic bitches, if that's the word in economics. I mean, maybe I want to use this opportunity to say, like, engage with as much as you can. It's a complex and scary world, but it's made scarier because people tell you that it's not for you. Like economics really is for everyone. So always keep engaging. If it's scary, keep going back, keep trying, because that's my journey. Well, I mean, let's look at the claim of a wage price spiral. Like as soon as there was the opportunity for an institution in the Fair Work Commission that is not the market to actually intervene and increase the minimum wage, which would flow on to about 2.3 million people, almost 25% of the workforce. In rolls in the business lobbyists and all of their henchmen who are saying this would be absolute doom. We'll create a wage price spiral. And what they're saying is labour costs increase and then businesses, they just got to pass those higher labour costs onto prices, right? That's obvious. But that hasn't been true for a very, very long time for the reasons I said earlier about wages going nowhere. So what they're trying to do, they're invoking like the scary spirits of the 1970s moment, which was the scariest moment for Australian capital because labour was most organised. And also the industrial relations system was very different, right? The industrial relations system, we had like not just high levels of unionisation and people prepared to go out and act collectively for their wage claims, but we had our institutions were organised to take that momentum and turn them into real change. So we could actually go out on strike for one sector of an industry and improve the conditions of the entire industry. That's the way the flow-on effects of our wage-setting institutions worked, because obviously we had the awards. This is pre-enterprise bargaining. So basically the infrastructure just isn't there.
Yeah, just on that. So Sally McManus, the head of the ACTU, tweeted this. Important fact, it is not possible for wages to move up in the way they did back in the 1970s. Back then, there was centralised bargaining and a completely different system. There are no mechanisms now to flow on pay increases to all workers. So you also had, industry-wide or sector bargaining in the 1970s. And so wins from a certain union, again, would flow on throughout the rest of that industry, which would then also feed into the rest of the economy. Now, some people were pointing to that tweet from Sally McManus as evidence that she thinks it's like a good thing or this is great. I don't think that's a particularly generous reading of what she's saying there. She's just pointing out the very different economic conditions. In the 1970s is when we had the peak of the share of national income going to labour, right? So that's when, as you say, it was very scary for capital because the share of national income going to labour peaked at about 63% of national income. Ever since then, thanks to all the wacky neoliberalism that's happened since and the rollout of that particular ideology and the attacks on working people, union density has crashed ever since over the past 50 years. And so to the point where today workers are way, way, way less powerful than they were back in the 1970s.
Yeah, that's a good overview. It's exactly how it went down. I think it's funny that Sally weirdly would cop flack for just describing the reality of what neoliberalism has done to our institutions. Of course, there's an issue there. It was bipartisan work that got us to this point. But I actually had similar weird backlash when I did a piece with ABC where I called out this idea of the wage price spiral. I was like, this is ridiculous. Labour organisation is nowhere near the same level of the 70s. And we don't have the institutions, whether they be unions, but also wage-setting institutions to actually broaden out those bigger pay increases in the same way. And I got, all this claim of like, that's exactly what the right of the faction of, and it's like, this is a description of reality. Right? Being clear about what's going on, as scary as it is, helps us to work out what institutions we have to build. And it's not about not believing in the power of industrial action to achieve many great things. But let's not muck around and believe it's just this pure performance of industrial action and the spirit of it that led us to the type of, 60% of national income that we had in the mid-70s. That was genuinely the reason why it was scary for capital is because we had momentum, and once you have workers moving and feeling that empowered at the side of the workplace, that's when they start talking about the organization of the economy. That's when they start talking about where should the profit motive exist and where should it not. And that's when it becomes a systematic crisis for capital. We are evidently nowhere near this point. And it's totally acceptable for the Secretary of the ACTU to call out the business lobbyists who are fear-mongering, and be able to also obviously have an interest in getting us to the point where we had that kind of organisation and redistributive power and distributive power again.
It feels like the other point, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, is about, I mean, what was the 1970s a wage price spiral as well? I mean, obviously workers had way more power. You had that flow-on effect. You had industry bargaining. So the more powerful that workers got, the wage increases they were winning, I assume did have some flow-on impact onto the state of inflation. But what you cannot leave out of that picture is the 1973 oil crisis. Again, another energy crisis, another fossil fuel-based energy crisis that came out with some Arab states wanting to boycott the state of Israel, which, again, that inflation crisis hit the entire Western world. And so that's the sort of 1973, which then flows on for the rest of the decade, which is when, and particularly in the 80s too, when inflation gets particularly insane, gets up into the double digits, close to 17, 18% by the end of the 80s. So, I mean, is capitalism such a shitty system that if workers get so much power like they did in the 1970s, the whole thing goes to pot? Or I guess, how should we think about that time in the 1970s? Is inflation an inevitable consequence of workers getting more power like they did back then?
Inflation is as much the decisions and actions of capital to backwards calculate from a profit rate. So once we understand that aspect of inflation, it's not purely just the tangible technical process of gathering resources, value adding, producing, selling, distributing, right? This is the substance of like really important stuff, I think, for progressives to learn and understand, because for this exact moment, if we are serious about being able to have an answer for inflation, then you need to be able to have an answer for how we organize production, how we could do it better. Technically and socially, right? Socially, we want to do it without necessarily a profit motive sometimes, depending on which markets we're talking about. So something was happening during the 70s, right? Over time, one of the biggest trends that's important for understanding that inflation terrain is that we dismantled our manufacturing sector, and we now have a majority services-based economy. This is very typical of, really Anglophone economies, market-based economies that handballed away high-wage unionised works, part of a deunionisation program, but also as a way for our capital to go off elsewhere and exploit cheaper labour that could make stuff, mostly cheaper, but then better over time too. And then obviously China is the glaring example, but also South Korea, Vietnam increasingly, our neighbours are increasingly powerhouses in manufacturing. And what's happened is class war here looks like our wages being kept stagnant while the costs of manufactured goods get cheaper. And so we can buy those things. We start to feel much richer, and we use more of our money to spend on services locally, going out, getting good healthcare and education, hospitality, retail, these sorts of things. So it's the restructuring of our economy and the types of industries we have that is a big part of the story about inflation and how it is that people feel inflation. When it comes to being able to pay more for stuff and being able to keep up with that, in many ways, if you have a services-based economy, it's much easier. We can pay. There's no reason why we can't have a high-wage, service-based economy with some advanced manufacturing on the end and not have an inflation spiral. Think of countries like Denmark, a lot of Scandinavians actually. But in order to get to a point where we can pay the wage level we want, provide the services and the goods that we want to each other without risking capital running off and dramatically elevating their prices in order to get higher profit rates, and then creating the kind of crisis we're in now, requires power. It requires power not just in the areas I've talked about of organisation of labour, wage setting institutions. It's also about industry policy. It's also about competition policy. It's about regulating, financial regulation, right? This is why I find this inflation moment so fascinating, because it gives us an insight into strategic questions and technical questions. And that's a long answer to your question. But the point is, if we reached a point, like this is what happened in the 1970s, okay? We had a point of high-level union militancy, great power in the workplaces, but that power in industry and in workplaces wasn't manifested, wasn't reflected in our institutions. And that's why when along comes, the smiling, I would call him a smiling assassin, but he's extremely effective at what he did, Bob Hawke, because he patched militancy and in organized labor, the muscle, with policy and the party. Mm. And that's what corporatism was. And I think I see a lot of my work and my interest in basically looking back at that period of history and asking, how can we make it that working people and their institutions have far more knowledge and say over that process of translating our power into policy and institutions? And how do we reorganize that process so we don't have the Accords again? We couldn't have the Accords again because we have nowhere near the power to have that kind of bargain anyway.
Because of the Accords.
Ironically. So it's a question of strategy and power, and you need to be able to look at capital head on and be able to take it on. And to do that, you need power. That has to be strategic and well timed. And I think Bernie Sanders was probably the best example of someone who understood what it meant to build up a movement behind that type of politics.
Now, that power thing is a good thing. We're seeing this analysis being rolled out. As you were saying, this is not a wage price spiral. Oh, this is not a wage price fueled inflation crisis that we're facing at the moment. This is a profit price inflation. That's the problem. And so people like Zara Sultana, a great leftist in the UK, tweeted, if we're worried about inflation, instead of squeezing workers' wages, let's squeeze corporate profits, CEO pay, and landlord rents. Sally McManus tweeted, looking forward to economists and others calling out company profits for driving inflation as businesses pass on price rises and gouge to pump up profits. Perhaps the RBA will call for a cap on profits or are workers to pay in price wages rises and wage cuts. So again, and you'll see this across the progressive spectrum, this idea that, there's all this talk about wage restraint. The governor of the Reserve Bank is saying, look, workers are really going to have to take a real wage pay cut in order for us to get inflation back to the level we want it to. And there is no discussion whatsoever from those institutional voices that, hey, maybe we could put controls on prices. Maybe we should say that the cost of inflation should come out of these record profits that corporations are reaching. Now, I think that's a very nice thing to say, and I think it's interesting. It is important to get that out there and to reframe the way we look at and talk about an inflation crisis, but I don't understand how that would happen. What are the actual levers that, say, a Labor government could do? What could workers do? How would you actually manifest that? And is the answer simply that, yes, organised labour is just too weak to do that, and the capitalist economic institutions that we have simply won't countenance such a suggestion because we're not allowed to, because profits have to keep growing and it's always workers who have to pay?
Well, I think coming back to the Accords, it's an example of how it is that we tried to approach this problem we're coming out of the period of the 70s into the 90s. And that was legitimately a negotiation between labour and capital. It was like the right to a decent life, for more of the value that a worker was producing on the job versus acceptable profit rates. So it was clear to capital at that point in the 70s, those profit rates weren't acceptable to them. Workers were too uppity. And this is, there's some great work by progressive economists throughout history that have pointed to why full employment is fundamentally at odds with the need for capital to maintain discipline and control over a workplace, over the workforce. You can't have people all in jobs. They need to fear unemployment. And they need to fear lower wages in order to maintain the status quo of production, the organisation of production. So the way that the Accords worked was that it was Labor saying to capital, you restrain your prices at these levels. It was very detailed work. This is what the prices will be. This is what the wage will be. And we accept that you need to earn a profit to do the work you do, right? To produce the thing you do that we want. We're far from being able to have that kind of bargain, all right? So I think in the meantime, well, it's not necessarily, I can't even envisage where it is that in what recent history will be, in recent future we'll be able to have that negotiation. But in the meantime, what we can do is acknowledge that in the neoliberal period, it has been fundamentally parasitic on the post-war reconstruction time where we built up a lot of our biggest institutions. We expanded, we brought TAFE in, we expanded education, we fixed up the fact that we had Depression era housing, kind of similar to the conditions we have today. And all that neoliberalism has done has just sort of like fed on those gains. And, the Whitlam period of social movement has just been eating away at those things. So what we can do is have a strong program of bringing all of those markets, so-called markets that were created for lazy capitalists, really, bringing them back into public hands and reducing the costs of government services, expanding government and the types of things that the public sector provides. It's a really quick way to deal with, an inflation problem that we've created by handing over the reins of a larger and larger section of our economy to the private sector. It means that they can hold us ransom. That's what they're doing. What we need to do is decrease the space in which they operate so that we can control prices more and more. Again, you're always going to get those bigger structural long-term questions from me.
But I suppose my question is, can the Albanese Labor government control prices on anything right now? Is there any kind of regulatory or legal framework through which the Labor government can say prices cannot increase in this particular industry or in this front? Or can they actually, if they wanted to, my argument would be they probably don't, but could they even do that? Or does the RBA have any power to do that?
The current government could immediately, if we're talking about this, in the near term kind of measures, make childcare free, expand public education, expand the Medicare system to reduce out-of-pocket costs, put the universities back into public hands, fix up the Hags system or eliminate it, make education free. And what that does is brings down the costs of essential goods, which are running at 6.6%. This is where our inflation is. It's a sickness of neoliberal government policy and the creation of markets in essential goods. And it's about, of course, centralised power we've seen the track record of Labor with dealing with, our multinational corporations that function out of fossil fuels and energy production. And they are clearly arms of relatively tied, but that would be a clear space where they need to be breaking up serious oligopoly power.
But they can't tell Coles to not increase the price of lettuce or whatever.
No, but what they could do is empower the producers. So part of the problem is our competition policy settings are really weak in Australia. Like they're much stronger in other countries where, you have proper oversight over when a company tries to eat up and expand their productions and basically reduce competition. What we have in the case of agriculture and supermarket, the duopolies here, is that our agricultural producers have less people to sell to. It means that like Woolworths or Coles is just like these behemoths that knock on the door and say, we will give you this price for what we want and we won't give you anything else. That's not a market. That's the type of buyer power that we have, at least in that very significant area of food production, of which Australia manufactures, by the way, almost 97% of the food that we consume. Like we could get this sector right. And of course that would mean not having an entire industry based on highly exploited migrant visa workers who are on often below minimum wage pay in these guest worker arrangements, highly exploited. Like we know all the stories. And it would be fair to say if we increased the wages and the production costs of producing those things that we need and want every day, prices could slightly increase. They might not as well if we could have organise production in that area better so that it came out of profits rather than coming out of our pockets as consumers and as workers.
What do you mean the bank is out of money? Insolvent? You only have enough cash for the next 3 customers? Hey,
Mentioned the RBA before. What should we think of the Reserve Bank? Does it suck? Is it an institution designed almost entirely to do the bidding of capital? As we say, this suggestion that in order to tackle inflation, that shit should come out of profits or the people who have way more money rather than the wages of workers. That doesn't seem to be countenanced. That's certainly not the way Philip Lowe seems to be thinking. Their prediction seems to have been way off all over the place. They predicted that interest rates wouldn't increase until the end of next year, I think. They've overestimated the unemployment rate heaps lately. So there's this natural rate of unemployment that won't kick in inflation was way too high. So basically, even though, again, one of their stated aims is to get us to full employment, they've been tolerating a much higher level of unemployment than we needed for a long period of time. There was a great piece from Benjamin Clark for Crikey sort of talking about how stacked the current Reserve Bank board is with, pro-capitalist ideological people. They've all been appointed since the Conservative government came to power. There was that story a little while ago that the Reserve Bank was giving $20,000 a year to the Centre for Independent Studies for all their wonderful research. I assume the Australia Institute doesn't get any money from the Reserve Bank to do the fantastic work that you do. That's weird, isn't it? It's a little bit weird. And in that piece, actually, he mentioned, so Bob Hawke and Bill Kelty, the head of the when they were at ACTU, they were on the board of the Reserve Bank. Do you know much about that? And I suppose it was making the case to say, hey, maybe a workers' representative like Sally McManus from the ACTU should be put on there to influence the decisions of this massive, apparently independent economic institution that might bring in some different ideas as to how we should tackle this kind of shit.
When global economies moved to this independent central banking framework, which was basically over time the response to the failures of giving the private sector power over credit creation. Like we only have to think about, financial market collapses many, many decades ago. So the response to that was to say, basically public credit creation is important. And so when we first started developing the same institutions of independent central banks that we're seeing around the world, it was much more aligned with, I guess, an institutional interventionist labour market policy approach. So, full employment, for instance, it's still on in the central bank's charter. And it was seen as part of the infrastructure of policy making, job and employment policy making. Over time, our central bank has shifted with the winds, that we've seen globally around, this adherence to a neoclassical monetarist version of economic policy, which says controlling the money supply is the biggest, and inflation control is the biggest objective of the bank. And that goes hand in hand with the explosion in financial markets and the need for them to play basically a strong role in securing the stability of financial markets and profit rates in the financial markets. So it's pretty clear, like if I think about just shooting to recent history of the RBA, I think this is a really good insight into the sort of identity crisis they are having. For a long time, they've believed, which is typical of the neoliberal, classical economics that permeated all through our institutions, I should say, not just central banks, right? I'm an ex-public servant. Like I said, that shit is deep. It's everywhere. And it'll be hard to root it out, really. And it's the belief that, markets are natural and well-functioning if left to themselves, especially and including in labour markets. So if unemployment, what we need to do is if we want wages to increase, this is the way that they sequentially think of it, unemployment just has to be tight. Like we have to get unemployment down lower. The reason why, wages aren't moving is because there's too many people looking for work. And so this is what the RBA used to say before the pandemic is like, all right, we want unemployment to drop because inflation was already very low at this point. We want unemployment to drop and then wages will naturally increase. And then we got to a point where unemployment was low and like wages weren't going anywhere. And it was like, all right, okay, something's up here. And I think that there was this interesting moment before the pandemic where the RBA started having like discussions with unions and like, more academics in labour law and industrial relations. And they seemed to be genuinely perplexed and trying to work out why there was no inherent or natural flow on from low unemployment, people being in jobs and wages going up. And of course, that's when you can very clearly outline that we've got a collapse of bargaining power. Why don't workers have power? Because the jobs got fundamentally shitter. We're not talking about close to full employment because everyone's at a full-time, secure, permanent job, have access to a union and so forth. We're talking about the division of full-time jobs increasingly into tiny little piecemeal shitty things, couple hours here, couple hours there. pretty clear those workers don't have the capacity to bargain for higher wages. So there was a technical problem in how they saw the mounting crises of the time, but they also didn't understand the institutions, the institutional framework for wage setting in Australia, which is mind-boggling. But then it gets to the absolute abstraction of these people from reality. Like, if you are a career public servant and you've lived in Canberra your whole life, you don't have a grip on reality. You don't know really what's going on outside in Australia. Canberra is not a reflection of reality. Having lived in Canberra, I can very much say that. Like, you don't have a pulse on the people when you talk to someone in a cafe in Canberra.
Well, the Reserve Bank is in fucking Martin Place, and I remember walking past Reserve Bank where all the fucking gold is, and then there are homeless encampments out the front, right? Like, just an absolute clear rendition or a manifestation of how insane our society is and our political economic institutions are. That the place which manages all the money and has all the gold is, their front steps are littered with people who can't afford a roof over their head. Beautiful stuff.
Yeah, it's a powerful image. So I think, like, I'm getting long to your question, which is, can we do it differently? Yes, I think that what we saw with, first the GFC, but then with COVID, is that a lot of the norms around the capacity of the government to spend money were completely blown open, right? They're blown out of the water. Hundreds of billions of dollars went into the stuff that we needed at that time, higher income support payments, making childcare free. And the RBA were like, sweet, we'll just keep interest rates super low so public debt won't be a problem, and we'll basically finance government spending. And all was made clear. It's been made very, very clear to all involved that we have the capacity for a public bank to fund the stuff that we want and we need to do. And that was pretty freaking scary for capital and for governments as well. They had to, what we're in this process now is backwards pedaling and try and reinstate all of the same norms and pretend like none of that ever happened. But I would say that there's a natural evolution and a progression towards public central banking. It's a really fascinating and exciting space. I think like the left should just get way more into. But I would say that.
It's Green's policy, by the way, to have a public bank. But FYI. The really scary shit is whether a recession is on the way, okay? And so people are probably familiar with this quote from Paul Keating.
This is a recession that Australia had to have.
Often held up as evidence of, yes, again, a detached mindset from the material realities of what a recession looks like for people, how devastating it can be. But if you're in econ world, then you sort of say, well, no, if we need to bring inflation down, then you need to contract economic growth, and that might be what's on the way. Some people are saying in the Fed Reserve is like deliberately angling for this, a recession to try and tackle this inflation crisis once and for all. Do you think that's coming in Australia?
It's likely. Yeah. I mean, we were teetering on the brink of recession before the pandemic hit. And actually, if you took out, at that point, pre-pandemic government spending, you just looked at the private sector, we were already in a recession. Yep. So look, I think government will be spending money if they're going to meet the commitments that they brought into the election. So if they start spending money to do stuff, that's going to put people into jobs, it's going to pay wages, it's going to keep this thing bubbling along. I think that we could enter a stage of a momentary, short-term recessionary environment. But I do think that the Labor Party won't allow that. They shouldn't allow that to continue, based on being able to meet the spending commitments and also the wage increases that they've said they're going to. Well, we've got the minimum wage increase, but we've also got funded wage increases for people in the care sector, the economy, fixing up like the absolute shit show that is our, essential care services is going to take money. So I guess the point is government spending is going to cushion some of this blow. But yeah, it does look like RBA has been doing some work to create the grounds for this false narrative that wages are to blame for this current situation and that we have to rein in people's spending. I think we should also think about the constituent parts of GDP, like what is growth? What does it mean to go into a recession? Like business investment has already collapsed from 2012 to pre-pandemic, but then it's collapsed even further. Post-war record low. So I think it's important to think about who's most active in the economy. It is consumers, it is workers, and government. Businesses are very active in that they are maintaining their power and gouging profits, higher profits. But in the post-war period, business investment is at its lowest point ever. But profits are at their highest point ever. So what we're looking at is basically the business sector on strike. They're already in that environment. They are already quite happy to maintain their, high market power and price gouge on the cost of essentials mostly, because that's pretty much what Australia's economy is. So business investment is already low. It can't be expected to be leading any revival in investment required for, GDP to lift. It's going to come from government spending. It's just about the timing of that spending. So we've got decreased money in workers' pockets right now because of the interest rate increase. We've got business investment, nothing getting put into it. If people stop spending as much, it's going to create potentially a recessionary environment, and it will be government spending that has to come in and turn the ship around. But I guess the question is, how long would Labor let that go for? What are they preparing for? Don't know. The timing of that spending? Don't know.
Well, there's a lot of talk about, laying the groundwork for an austerity budget. It seems to me, lots of talk about, we're looking at these figures and these are really bad. But of course, we can stick to those massive tax cuts for the rich, which the Greens would like to oppose. But anyway, that's a whole other discussion indeed. I thought we should finish on, a happy note. People should get fucking active, and they should, and workers should get organised and join their union. And a great example of what that looks like and how fucking awesome it is Mick Lynch from the RMT union in the UK. There's this massive rail strike going on. They've been fucked over by the rail companies. They are going on strike to protect their jobs and conditions. And Mick Lynch is the head of that union and has been across the media just owning every single critic, an incredible, solid socialist, working class guy who takes absolutely no shit, who has a sense of humor, and is consistently and clearly explaining the moral case, the logical case, the economic case for why they're going on strike, and why, yes, it does inconvenience millions of people across the UK, but it's entirely justified because this is what workers have to do in order to protect their conditions and get a better deal.
If you're saying that everyone deserves a pay rise, are you not worried about the impact that this could have on inflation, which is, the very thing that everyone's really concerned about? The Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey calling for pay restraint because it could...
Well, his pay restraint, he's on £600,000 a year, as is the chief of Network Rail. There are railway bosses taking home millions of pounds every year. The railways made £500 million of profit last year when fares and passengers were at an all-time low. People are stripping money out of the railway. They're stripping money out of the economy. And if workers' wages don't go up, it means a transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. We've got more billionaires than we've ever had in this country. The rich have never been richer. And the reason they're able to do that and get richer all the time is because they're deliberately depressing workers' wages. Inflation has come on board now, and virtually nobody's had a pay rise for the last 2 or 3 years. So this idea that there's a wages price spiral is nonsense.
And he makes me so happy and inspiring. A beautiful glimpse of what feels like something like a lost era, or what young people in Australia and the UK today don't see nearly enough, which is, a union leader who's organised and uncompromising and staring down the forces of capital and saying, nah, mate, don't muck me about, innit? This is the fucking way it goes, and that. I know you've been enjoying watching Mick Lynch's work. You're a fan?
Oh, yeah. Like, straight into the veins. I'm loving it. For me, it's so amazing how these little moments people can pop up after, in a sea of misery, and, when you're like fighting so hard and you just don't know when things are going to turn around, and then it just takes someone to step up like that, and it gives you a lot of energy and a lot of reinvokes your commitment to what we're doing. And Mick Lynch is that for me, absolutely. Like the last week or so, I've just been loving him in action. And what it strikes me is, and there's so many angles to what's happening. There's almost this total disbelief or ill preparedness of the media class for someone of his caliber, and also because they fundamentally that's because these, high educated, higher wealth individuals, which they are increasingly in mainstream media, this is how low they think of working people. That someone, an elected leader of one of the largest unions, of people who operate massive machinery, highly complex systems that move people around an economy, and you think that having a conversation with a leader of an empowered workforce, like you think that low of that person, that he's not going to come out guns blaring and be able to murder you and be able to completely demolish your arguments, and would have fucking heard it all. He has heard it all, right? Like, and seen it all. And I think that's the power of working class leadership and experience, and the value of independence, true working class independence, a class perspective that is not beholden to any political paradigms or any vested economic interest. It is so valuable and so powerful. And gosh, we need those leaders here. And I hope your listeners keep watching what's happening there, and keep your eye on industrial struggles in general across comparable economies, because I do think that's the direction we're going in. And Australia is always 5 or 6 years behind our neighbours in that regard, but it's exciting stuff.
I mean, you should watch Piers Morgan's entire interview with Mick Lynch. Piers Morgan, the dumbest man in media across the board. Absolute cunt, straight up. And Mick Lynch hands him his ass on a plate, which is fantastic. But also the really encouraging thing is the public response. Other working people get it. You've had media organizations interviewing people on platforms saying, yeah, this is a fucking nightmare. This has thrown my plans into chaos, but I completely understand what they're doing and I support it, right? The public opinion across the board, people are standing with the rail strikers. They understand it. And the suggestion from millionaire media commentators that workers are getting too greedy and actually have a very good life, and actually this is really inconvenient, and actually can't you go on strike at a better time, and hey, I support your right to strike, but not like this. All of that is just like bullshit and melted away. And so I think as diminished as organised labour is in the neoliberal period, as much as unions are missing from many people's lives as a real social institution that can change their lives, like that just general sense that we're getting fucked over by people at the top is still very much alive and well. I would love to see the Labor Party key into that more. I absolutely think the Greens need to capitalise on that more and, identify themselves as a party of most people, of most working people that's, believes in people's right to strike and encourages people to get organised and stuff. You love to see it, and we want to see more of it, please.
I absolutely want if the Greens could do heaps more worker rights, industrial stuff, I think that would be really, really great. I think it's important to recognise we've got a parallel here in Australia. We had Sydney Trains several years ago. People might remember, I think it was like 2016. Don't quote me on that though. Were ready to walk out on strike. It was going to be an illegal action. And it went to the New South Wales Industrial Relations Court, or maybe it was the Fair Work Commission ruled it illegal. And all of the build up to that moment where it was like these vox pops on the streets or people at train stations, like where trains weren't arriving, and you could see the media trying to invoke like this, didn't you get let down by these scumbags? And they were like, look, it's tough. Like, it's going to be hard to get home. I have to get a bus, but I understand, like, it's pretty difficult stuff for them. And it's like in that moment, it was really exciting because it was clear that there was this massive malignment from New South Wales government, from Sydney Trains, the media, with the public and the unions. And that strike didn't go ahead. It was totally heartbreaking and devastating. But that cross perspective, it was established, it was ready to go. I think it's still there. Important to recognise our New South Wales Teachers Federation comrades who are now have aligned with the independent unions, the IAU, to go on strike, and the New South Wales government is threatening to bring in much higher fines to basically scare them out of taking further industrial action. It's similar to what's going on in the UK in that the rail union is trying to genuinely bargain with the rail operators, of which there are many, but it's the government that is refusing to fund increased pay increases or refusing to cop any of the costs associated with their contracting practices. And similar here in New South Wales, you've got a very, very hostile government that is threatening to persecute and come after unionists and charge them, large volumes for taking industrial action. The lesson here is, yes, business interests are being protected at every point, but we have extremely hostile neoliberal governments that will pull out all stops to protect the status quo as well. I guess a shout out then to our teacher comrades in New South Wales, who I think are showing real leadership for public sector unionism, for teachers across Australia, and for all of us, for everyone involved in industrial work.
Too right.
Let me show you what I believe is your Facebook page. I want you to confirm or deny if this is your Facebook page. It's a picture of the hood from Thunderbirds.
Can you see the likeness?
Well, I'm just wondering where the comparison goes, because he was obviously an evil, criminal, terrorist mastermind, described as the world's most dangerous man who wreaked utter carnage and havoc on the public.
Is that the level you're pitching this at, Piers? That is a joke amongst me and my friends, and you can see the likeness, if you like.
So you're not denying that you are comparing yourself to the hood?
I'm not comparing myself to anyone. I'm me.
You've literally made your profile picture the hood. And I'm simply saying I was a massive...
What? If it was a bunch of flowers...
Thunderbirds fan, and the hood was the most dangerous, evil person in the world.
He's the most evil puppet made out of vinyl in the world. Is that the level your journalism's at these days?
I simply asked you if that was you and your Facebook page.
Well, do you think I look like the most evil person in the world, Piers?
Hello, I'm Alan Partridge. Sadly, I can't be with you because I'm on a nationwide tour, performing in person each night to an audience bigger than Piers Morgan gets on the actual telly. But the good thing about Piers is it doesn't bother him.
Alison Pennington, the call to action this week is join a union. Join a union if you're not already. You can go to australianunions.org.au/join. Remember that not all unions are affiliated with the ACTU. If you're in retail, for example, I would suggest checking out RAFWU, not so much the SDA, but that's just my personal opinion. RAFWU.org.au. For retail workers, they're fantastic. You know, as flawed as the union movement can be, blah, blah, blah. They're not perfect institutions, of course, but getting organised with your comrades and asserting your power at work is vital to a better society. So do that, please. I also want to give a shout out to me. I have a show coming out on the BBC radio. It's a stand-up special. It's called Solastalgia. I recorded a couple of weeks ago here in Australia, but it's coming out on the BBC tonight on Sunday, UK time. Anyway, we'll put the link in the show notes for the show. I think if you like this show, you like the Greens, you'll enjoy that. Hopefully a whole bunch of jokes about the end of the world and the climate crisis. Thank you, Alison Pennington. It's been a delight talking to you, my friend.
Absolute pleasure, Tom. I wish we could have more of these discussions and debates. It's great.
Yes, let's have many more. Obviously, yes, people follow you on Twitter. Check out the work for the Centre for Future Work and yourself. Anything else that you need to plug or people could check out if they like your stuff?
As I'm leaning over my shoulder, I just like to plug my awesome Ned Kelly poster just behind there. That's pretty good. I'm not sure if it's visible. Yeah, follow the work of the Centre for Future Work at the Australian Institute and keep on keeping on. Keep your heads up. Keep fighting. Revolution. See you at the barricades. Rate and review this show, Serious Danger, on Apple Podcasts. If you can't become a patron, sharing it around really helps us out. You can follow us on Twitter at SeriousDangerAU. We're on Instagram. Subscribe to us on YouTube too if you're watching this on YouTube. And email us anytime. hello@seriousdangerpod.com. Thanks, Alison. Bye, everyone. Cheers. Bye.
Serious Danger Australia.